Three women walk into a party. Same father, same fortune, same ethereal pale skin and blue-eyed blonde hair that made film director John Huston call them collectively witches. Lovely ones, to be sure. They are Aileen, Maureen, and Oonagh Guinness, daughters of the brewing empire, and in the late 1920s, they are the most photographed, most envied, most written about women in British and Irish high society. The press calls them the Golden Guinness Girls. They look like a matched set. They aren't. Within 40 years, one will have buried a first husband killed in aerial combat over Sudan, watched a second marriage drain her fortune, and sold off the castle she'd spent decades filling with movie stars. Another will have raised children so hollowed out by her neglect that the damage runs 3 generations deep, and produced a memoir just to document the wreckage. And the youngest, the warmest, the most generous, the one who opened her home to poets and painters and tried hardest to give what her own childhood had never given her. She will have buried 2 children and lived out her last decades in a country that wasn't her own. The money won't have saved any of them. That's the point. This isn't a story about a curse, though the curse framing is useful and we'll come back to it. It's a controlled experiment that history ran without anyone's permission. 3 women, identical starting conditions, 3 completely different brands of ruin. The question isn't what went wrong. The question is why it went wrong differently for each of them, and what that tells us about what privilege actually is. Arthur Ernest Guinness was the second son of Edward Cecil Guinness, the first Earl of Iveagh, the man who industrialized Guinness and turned it into the most profitable brewery in the world. Arthur attended Eton and then Trinity College Cambridge, took his engineering degree, and went to Dublin to learn the trade. He was assistant managing director by 1902, vice chairman by 1913, and on July 15, 1903, he married Marie Clothilde Russell, daughter of Sir George Russell, the 4th Baronet. Within 7 years, they had 3 daughters. The family lived at Glenmaroon House in Castleknock, just outside Dublin, on an estate Arthur had acquired in 1903 and immediately expanded. By 1911, he had added one of the first private swimming pools in Ireland. In 1921, when Maureen was about to turn 14, he loaded the whole family onto his yacht, the Fantome, and sailed them around the world for a year. In 1923, with the Irish Civil War close enough that their cousin Henry Guinness had been burned out of his home by Republican forces, Arthur moved the family to London permanently. The material circumstances were extraordinary. The emotional ones weren't. His daughters later recalled a childhood defined by its absences, a father whose primary interest was his business, who lavished money and withheld attention, who presided over a house full of grand rooms and grand silences. The girls grew up largely in each other's company, 3 blonde heads at the windows of Glenmaroon, watching the Easter Rising unfold from a bridge near the house in 1916, aware that the world outside was erupting, while their world inside remained very, very still. Each daughter would spend the rest of her life trying to fill that particular silence. Each would use a different method. Each method would fail in its own distinctive way. When Arthur brought the girls to London in 1923, he brought them into the exact moment the city was inventing the bright young things. That chaotic, photographed, half-drunk cavalcade of aristocrats, socialites, and artists who treated the 1920s as a performance. Maureen was appearing in gossip columns by January 1924, noted alongside her sisters as the vivacious young daughters of Ernest Guinness. By 1925, she had been presented at court to King George V and Queen Mary. The sisters didn't merely enter this world. They became its defining faces, its recurring headlines, the names editors reached for when they needed a caption for everything that made the decade feel like it was daring itself. Evelyn Waugh documented this milieu directly. His 1930 novel, Vile Bodies, drew on the bright young things circuit, on parties that lasted 3 days and people who seemed to have exchanged substance for spectacle. Cecil Beaton photographed the sisters. The gossip columns tracked their movements. Novelist Emily Horrockin, who has written extensively on the sisters, describes a shorthand that attached itself to them. Maureen was scary. Oonagh was sweet. Aileen was aloof. John Huston, encountering them in this period, landed on the word witches and meant it as the highest possible compliment. Each daughter would receive £1 million from their father on marriage, roughly £65 million in today's purchasing power. They weren't merely rich. They were the kind of rich that makes normal calculations irrelevant. Eileen married first, in November 1927, to the Honourable Brinsley Sheridan Plunkett. They had 3 daughters, Nelia, Doone, and Marcia, who died at 3 years old. The marriage unraveled and they divorced in 1940. Brinsley was killed in aerial combat over Sudan in November 1941, 11 months after the divorce, which is the kind of timing that makes grief complicated in ways that don't resolve neatly and don't get discussed at parties. Maureen married Basil Sheridan Hamilton Temple Blackwood on July 3, 1930, her cousin, because the Guinness family had a habit of marrying within its own gravitational field. Basil was the eldest son of the 3rd Marquess of Dufferin and Ava, and Maureen became a marchioness while still on honeymoon, when Basil's father died in a plane crash before they returned. Barely in her 20s, she already held one of the grandest titles in British aristocracy. Oonagh married Hon Philip Kindersley, 2nd son of the banker Robert Kindersley, 1st Baron Kindersley, on 24th June 1929 at 19. She was the youngest sister and would eventually be the most married, 3 husbands in total, and the one who tried hardest to build a life that was warm rather than merely spectacular. What that attempt cost her is the cruelest part of this story. Aileen is the easiest sister to misread because her public life was genuinely magnificent. In December 1956, she married Valerian Stux Rybar, whom the design world called the most expensive interior decorator alive, and they established themselves at Lutterelstown Castle, a 570-acre estate near Dublin. Princess Grace of Monaco came, Prince Rainier, David Niven, Ronald Reagan, Paul Newman, Fred Astaire. Eileen installed a nightclub in the castle's basement, remodeled rooms, filled the place with art. She threw fancy dress parties, masked parties, one notorious dinner where food was served directly on the floor and guests were forbidden to pick it up. In the 1930s, she'd conducted an affair with Austrian playboy Baron Hubert von Pantz, who was simultaneously conducting an affair with Coco Chanel, which suggests the era had an economy of romantic scale that has since been lost. She had already hosted the Duchess of Windsor and Douglas Fairbanks Jr., and Fruity Metcalf, best man to the Duke of Windsor. Luttrellstown was a stage, and Eileen ran it brilliantly. But the Stux-Rybar marriage was a slow financial hemorrhage. Rybar's tastes matched and then exceeded Eileen's income. By 1965, they had separated, the official characterization being that he had become an extravagance even she couldn't afford. By 1983, after more than half a century at the property, Eileen sold Luttrellstown Castle and all 570 acres to the Swiss-based Primwest Group. The castle that had been her performance space, her compensation mechanism, the elaborate answer she had constructed to a childhood question she couldn't quite articulate. Gone. She lived until March 31st, 1999, dying at 94, the last of the 3 sisters to go. She outlasted the glamour and outlasted most of the guests. Whether she outlasted the emptiness the glamour was designed to cover is harder to determine and probably not knowable. Maureen is the most uncomfortable of the three to discuss because she was also the most accomplished, and those two things coexist without canceling each other out. In 1949, following her father's death, she and a cousin became the first women ever to sit on the board of the Guinness Brewery. This was a structural appointment at the apex of one of Britain's most powerful commercial dynasties, and it was genuinely unprecedented. She held the position with the same force she brought to everything. Cecil Beaton, who knew her well and wasn't easily impressed, once introduced her at a dinner party with, "Do you realize that you have here in Maureen Dufferin the biggest bitch in London?" She reportedly found this funny. She wore the judgment the way she wore her rhinestone spectacles, defiantly, as an accessory. Her husband Basil, the fourth Marquess, was killed on March 25, 1945. He was serving with the Indian Field Broadcasting Unit when he was filmed demanding the surrender of Japanese troops sheltering in a tunnel, and a mortar shell landed on the unit just weeks before his 36th birthday. The historical irony was almost literary. His grandfather, the first Marquess of Dufferin and Iveagh, had, as Viceroy of India, declared war on Burma and annexed it for Britain. The family's imperial ambition had come full circle in a single mortar burst. Basil left 3 children and an estate mortgaged heavily against gambling debts, which Maureen paid off with Guinness money, absorbed without apparent sentimentality, and moved forward. She married Major Desmond Buchanan in September 1948 and divorced in 1954. She married Judge John Cyril Maude in August 1955. They lived largely separate lives for 3 decades, until Maude's death in 1986. Meanwhile, Maureen performed. Barry Humphries, creating Dame Edna Everage, drew directly on her fashion excess and social snobbery. The cartoonist Osbert Lancaster modeled the character Maudie Littlehampton in the Daily Express on her public persona. At a book launch in 1996, she arrived wearing an exaggerated black oilskin sou'wester, a 1940s fur coat with padded shoulders, platform shoes, and pale blue rhinestone spectacles, and announced, loudly enough for the reverent hush of Hatchards to carry it across the room, that it was a pity they didn't have sperm banks when Noel Coward was alive. What multiple biographers document, and what her children confirmed in their own words and lives, is that behind this performance was a mother who was absent in the ways that matter most. Nancy Schoenberger's biography of Lady Caroline Blackwood, Dangerous Muse, depicts Maureen as narcissistic, preoccupied with London's social life to the exclusion of her children at the Clandeboy estate in County Down. Caroline, Perdita, and Sheridan were left largely unsupervised to roam the estate, warmth rationed in the same house where money was never a constraint. Ivana Lowell, Maureen's granddaughter, published a memoir called Why Not Say What Happened, that documents growing up inside the Guinness shadow, the inheritance that runs deeper than money, the family pattern of absence and damage replicated downward through generations, like a structural flaw in architecture that only shows itself when something heavy is placed on the floor. Caroline Blackwood was born the 16th of July, 1931, eldest of Maureen's 3 children. She became a writer and a muse, beautiful enough and singular enough that Lucian Freud married her in December 1953 and painted her repeatedly, and brilliant enough that Robert Lowell, arguably America's greatest living poet at the time, left his wife for her. When Lowell died in 1977, he was reportedly still clutching one of Freud's portraits of Blackwood in the back seat of a New York taxi. She had that effect on people. Her own internal life, though, told the story of what Maureen's mothering had produced. She drank heavily and cyclically. Her eldest daughter, with the composer Israel Sitkowitz, Natalia, died on June 22, 1978, at 17, from an accidental drug overdose. Caroline Blackwood died on the 14th of February, 1996, at the Mayfair Hotel in New York, of cancer, the alcohol having done its deeper damage long before the diagnosis. She was 64. Sheridan, Maureen's only son who succeeded as the 5th Marquess of Dufferin and Ava, died on May 29, 1988, at 49, from an AIDS-related illness. 2 of Maureen's 3 children predeceased her. She died on the 3rd of May, 1998, at 91, having outlived much of what she had never bothered to nurture. And then there is Oonagh, the youngest sister, Oonagh, the sweet one, the self-described favorite of her father's 3 daughters, chose a direction that was the opposite of performance. She didn't build an audience. She built a home for other people to inhabit. After her marriage in April 1936 to Dominic Brown, 4th Baron Oranmore and Brown, her father gave her Lugala, an 18th-century hunting lodge inside a glacial valley in County Wicklow, surrounded by a dark lake and steep wooded hills. She turned it into something close to a secular church for Irish and British artistic life. Brendan Behan came to Lugala. Samuel Beckett came. John Huston came. Back again. Oonagh described the place as the most decorative honeypot in Ireland. And that was accuracy rather than vanity. She didn't host as performance. She sustained people. She gave artists time and space, and the particular gift of not making them feel like entertainment, which is a rarer gift than it sounds. She had 2 children from her first marriage to Philip Kindersley, gay, born June 1930, and Tessa, born 31st of January 1932. Tessa died in 1946 at the age of 14, following a diphtheria injection. A routine procedure. A child went in healthy and didn't come out. Oonagh was 36 when she buried her daughter. Her second marriage to Dominic Brown produced 3 children. Garrick, born 25th of June 1939, an unnamed son, born December 1943, who died in infancy, and Tara, born March 4th, 1945. They divorced in 1950. Her third marriage, in 1957, to Miguel Ferreras Achiro, presented to the world as a New York dress designer, lasted until 1965, when it was annulled after the revelation that Ferreras was, in fact, José María Ozores Laredo, a former Spanish fascist and SS soldier living under a stolen identity who had spent a significant portion of Oonagh's fortune in the process. 3 marriages, 2 of them ending in dissolution or betrayal. 1 daughter already in the ground. And then, December 1966. Tara Brown had grown up at Lugala and grown into the precise physical embodiment of swinging London. Beautiful, wealthy, wired into everything. At 21, he stood to inherit £1 million on his 25th birthday. He had married Noreen McSherry in August 1963, fathered 2 sons, and by 1966 was orbiting the innermost ring of the counterculture. His 21st birthday party at Lugala earlier that year had 2 private jets chartered to bring 200 guests: Mick Jagger, Brian Jones, Anita Pallenberg, John Paul Getty Jr., actress Siobhan McKenna. Brian Jones, by multiple accounts, considered Tara his closest friend and fell into irreconcilable depression after he died. On December 17, 1966, Tara was driving his Lotus Elan through South Kensington with his girlfriend, the model Suki Potier, when his car collided with a parked lorry at the junction of Redcliffe Gardens and Redcliffe Square. He died of his injuries the following day, December 18th, at age 21. He left an estate worth £56,069, a fraction of what he'd stood to inherit, spent into the life he'd loved. The coroner's inquest was reported on January 17, 1967. John Lennon read the inquest in the Daily Mail. The report described a 21-year-old Guinness heir who had failed to notice that the lights had changed, driven at speed through a junction, and died. Lennon was already assembling a collage-style song with Paul McCartney, and the image locked into place. He wrote, "He blew his mind out in a car. He didn't notice that the lights had changed." The song was A Day in the Life. It became the closing track of Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, released 26 May 1967, 5 months after Tara died. Lennon confirmed the connection. Music historians have documented it extensively. Tara Brown's 21 years became, improbably, permanently embedded in the most acclaimed album in the history of popular music. Oonagh had already buried one child. Now she had buried a second. She was 56. She transferred Lugala to her son Garrick in 1970, the house she had given herself entirely to, and eventually moved to the south of France. She cared for Tara's 2 young sons alongside Mexican twins she had adopted, continuing to mother children that circumstance had delivered to her, even when her own were gone. She died on August 2nd, 1995, in County Wicklow, at 85, back in Ireland at the end. The Guinness curse is, by now, a journalistic brand. Later generations provided its darkest catalogue: addiction, suicide, accidents across the family's scattered branches, and the media packaged the accumulation into something that sounds fated, cosmic, prescripted. Curses are useful narratively because they suggest the tragedies were inevitable, that nobody was responsible, that it was written somewhere before anyone could read. This is comforting and also wrong. What the actual story documents is more specific and more uncomfortable. Arthur Ernest Guinness gave each daughter £1 million and gave none of them enough of himself. That ratio, staggering material surplus, emotional scarcity, didn't produce one outcome. It produced 3, each shaped by the particular woman trying to compensate for the same original deficit. Eileen tried glamour. She built a castle full of royalty and film stars and a basement full of music, and turned Luttrellstown into the most spectacular answer she could construct to the silence of Glenmaroon. When the money eroded and the marriages failed and the castle was sold, what remained was a very long and very quiet afterward. She had 94 years, which is a lot of time to spend with yourself when the performances have all concluded. Maureen tried power. The aristocratic title in her 20s, the board seat at 42, the persona so formidable that even Beaton's most cutting introduction made her laugh. She succeeded, by almost every worldly measure, at everything she attempted. The cost of that success was paid by Caroline, by Perdita, by Sheridan, by Natalia, by Ivana Lowell, by everyone who needed warmth from a woman who had decided warmth wasn't among the things worth prioritizing. The damage didn't stop with Maureen's children. It moved downward, generation by generation, the way structural failures in buildings tend to manifest not at the top, but at the foundations. Oonagh tried love. She opened her house and she filled it with people, and she married 3 times and she gave Lugala everything she had. And the universe, indifferent to effort, took her daughter at 14 and took her son at 21 and left her to live 3 more decades with the particular loneliness of having loved more completely than she was loved back. The money didn't cause any of this, but it amplified everything. It gave each woman the resources to pursue her coping mechanism at full scale. Eileen's performances were grander. Maureen's social position was higher. Oonagh's artist colony was more lavish, which meant that when the mechanism failed, it failed at full scale too. Publicly enough for biographers and documentary makers and obituary writers to catalog the dimensions of the wreck. The Marquis of Dufferin shot by a mortar in a country his own grandfather had annexed for Britain. Tessa Kindersley dead at 14 from a routine injection. Tara Brown's brief life folded into a Beatles song, giving him an afterlife his mother had no hand in and no comfort from. Caroline Blackwood, brilliant and damaged in exactly the proportions her mother had manufactured, dying in a New York hotel at 64, with Lucian Freud's portrait of her still circulating in the world long after she was gone. This isn't a curse. It's a ledger. It's what happens when the accounts of childhood come due decades later, with compound interest, in the specific currencies each person was least equipped to afford. Oonagh was the first of the three sisters to go in August 1995, and perhaps that is the right place to end. She was the one who tried hardest to give what Glenmaroon had withheld. She arranged her entire life around warmth and generosity and the belief that love, properly offered, would eventually be returned in kind. She gave Lugala to the poets and the painters and kept giving after the house was gone. And still, a daughter at 14, a son at 21, a third marriage to a man who turned out to be somebody else entirely. Same father, same fortune. Same White House in Castleknock, looking down at a city in the middle of its own revolution. Three women who walked out of it into a world that had more money than it knew what to do with, and less emotional intelligence than the situation required. The wealth didn't curse them. The wealth just ensured that whatever they were going to become, they became it at a scale the rest of us could see clearly from a distance. Subscribe for more stories like this.